Sarah had never believed in true evil, not in the way that horror stories and myths described it. She had seen darkness, sure. As a psychiatric nurse, she had treated the mentally ill, the lost souls who had fallen so deep into their own madness that they'd become unrecognizable even to themselves. But there was always some form of logic behind their brokenness. Until she met Art the Clown. She thought she'd left him behind, a ghost of a memory locked away in a padded cell. It had been years since she worked in that asylum, but the images of his pale face, that grotesque frozen smile, still haunted her dreams. But that was all it was, just dreams. Or so she told herself every morning when she woke, breathless, sheets soaked in sweat. She had moved on, had to. The day she left the asylum, she swore she would never look back. But today, something felt different. The October air, sharp and cold, pricked at her skin as she walked home from the grocery store. The streets were lined with decorations, paper skeletons hanging from porches, pumpkins glowing with warm candlelight. She usually found comfort in the mundane festivity, but today a chill ran down her spine. Something was wrong. She stopped at the corner of Maple and Elm, staring ahead at her modest house at the end of the block. There was something off about it, something she couldn't quite place. The curtains were drawn, the front porch light flickered faintly. She took a deep breath and shook her head, willing herself to stop being so paranoid. There was nothing there, nothing but shadows. Yet, as she climbed the front steps and reached for her key, she froze. A smear of red, barely noticeable against the chipped white paint of the doorframe, caught her eye. Blood? No, she thought, must be a trick of the light. But the dread gnawing at her gut said otherwise. She reached out hesitantly, her fingers trembling as they brushed against it. Wet. Her heart pounded in her chest as her instincts screamed at her to turn around, leave, run. Instead, she pushed the door open slowly, the creaking hinge echoing in the silence. She stepped inside and stood in the dim hallway, the faint scent of copper filling her nostrils. Her mind raced as her eyes adjusted to the darkness. Everything looked normal at first glance. The hallway mirror, the small table by the door, nothing out of place. But then she saw it on the far wall, smeared across the wallpaper in jagged, dripping letters. "Remember me." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment the world tilted. She staggered backward, her hand clutching the door frame for support. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. He was locked away. Dead, maybe. He couldn't have followed her here. But the blood was real. The message was real. Art was real. She stumbled into the living room, her heart pounding in her ears. Her phone. She needed to call James. He had been her rock ever since she left the asylum, the only one who believed her when she said Art was something more than just a deranged killer. He had seen the aftermath of Art's handiwork. He knew what the clown was capable of. Her fingers fumbled as she dialed, every second stretching into an eternity. The ringing tone seemed too loud, too harsh in the eerie silence. She heard the click of the line connecting, but no voice followed. Just static. "James?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling. The static hissed, louder now, almost deafening. And then she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. Laughter. Soft, quiet at first, but growing louder, more distorted. That damn laugh. The one she thought she'd never have to hear again. She dropped the phone, her hands trembling as the laughter echoed in the empty house. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once, filling her with a paralyzing dread. She backed away, her feet stumbling over the rug as she desperately scanned the room for something, anything that could help her make sense of this nightmare. But there was nothing, only shadows and laughter. In the distance, a faint thudding sound drew her attention to the kitchen. She hesitated, her feet rooted to the spot, but the noise persisted. Reluctantly, she moved toward the kitchen, each step feeling like a battle against her instincts to flee. When she reached the doorway, she froze. The back door was ajar, the wind pushing it open just slightly before it would fall back into place with a soft thud. Her breath hitched as she saw something lying on the kitchen floor. A small package, wrapped in gaudy Christmas paper, sat in the middle of the room. Her hands shook as she stepped forward, her pulse roaring in her ears. With a deep breath, she crouched down and hesitantly reached for the package. The paper was slick, and when she looked closer, she realized why. Blood seeped from beneath the wrapping, soaking into the cheap holiday design. The room spun. She staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth as bile rose in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out before it was too late, but her legs felt like lead. She couldn't leave, not yet. The package lay at her feet, a sickening omen of what was to come, and she knew, deep down in the part of her mind where logic and reason no longer held sway, that this was only the beginning. The first mark had been made. Art was back. And this time he wasn't playing around. The days that followed blurred together in a sickening haze of dread and sleepless nights. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was a familiar sensation, one she'd lived with during her time at the asylum when Art the Clown had first twisted her perception of reality. But now it was worse, more invasive. Every creak in the floorboards, every shift of the wind against her windows felt like a harbinger of something darker, something inevitable. She barely left the house, convinced that the moment she stepped outside, he would be there, waiting. But even the house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become a maze of shadows, every room a trap where her fears lurked, waiting for the right moment to strike. It didn't help that the messages kept coming, taunting her with the knowledge that Art was closer than she realized. It was always the same. A small, seemingly innocuous package left on her porch or by her window, like a sickening parody of a gift. But inside, the contents were a reminder of Art's twisted game. A bloodied lock of hair, a broken toy, a cracked mirror. Each item was more personal, more grotesque than the last, and each one left her feeling more vulnerable, as though she was being dismantled piece by piece, her sanity slipping through her fingers like sand. One night, just past midnight, the phone rang again. Sarah jolted upright in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound was jarring, slicing through the suffocating silence like a knife. She hesitated before reaching for it, her hand trembling as her fingers brushed the receiver. She knew who it would be. It was always him now. She lifted the phone to her ear but said nothing. The silence on the other end was deafening. And then came the static, the familiar crackling that made her skin crawl. She waited, knowing what was coming. She didn't have to wait long. The laughter started as a low chuckle, almost like a whisper carried through the air, before it grew louder, more maniacal. Art's laugh was unlike anything she had ever heard. It was wrong, inhuman, and it echoed inside her head long after she slammed the phone down, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She sat in the darkness, the weight of his presence pressing down on her chest like a physical force. He was toying with her, savoring her fear, feeding off it. But why? Why hadn't he killed her yet? Sarah knew the answer even before she could fully form the question. This was part of the game, the anticipation, the dread, the silence before the scream. Art was waiting for the perfect moment, the moment when she was at her most vulnerable, her most broken. She tried to sleep after that, but every sound was amplified in the stillness of the night. The ticking of the clock on her wall sounded like a countdown. The distant hum of traffic outside her window felt like it was growing closer. And then, just as she was about to drift off, she heard it. Footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. She shot up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside her bedroom door. She stared at the door, waiting for it to creak open, for Art to step into the room with that sickening grin stretched across his face. But the door remained closed. The silence was worse than the footsteps. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She grabbed it, her hands shaking as she unlocked the screen. A new message. "Are you scared yet?" Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words, her vision blurring with terror. Her fingers hovered over the reply button, but she didn't know what to say. What could she say? There was no reasoning with Art. He was a force of nature, a living nightmare that had come to claim her. The phone buzzed again, and this time an image popped up on the screen. It was a picture of her house. The angle was strange, taken from high above, like someone had been watching from the rooftop across the street. In the picture, she could see herself, standing frozen in the doorway of her bedroom, her face a mask of fear. A cold realization washed over her. He was here, right now, somewhere close, watching her. She glanced towards the window, her pulse racing. The curtains fluttered slightly in the breeze, but beyond them the street was empty. Or was it? She stumbled out of bed, her legs weak beneath her, and crept toward the window. Every muscle in her body was tense, every instinct screaming at her to run, to get out. But she needed to know. She needed to see. She pulled the curtains back, her breath hitching in her throat. The street outside was still, bathed in the eerie glow of the street lights. Nothing moved, but she knew he was there, watching, waiting. Another message appeared on her phone. This time it was a video. She clicked on it, her heart racing, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the phone. The video was shaky, taken from behind the glass of a window. It took her a moment to realize that the window in the video was hers. And then the camera shifted, and she saw him. Art the clown, standing on the sidewalk outside her house, staring up at her window with that grotesque smile, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. The video ended abruptly, leaving her in suffocating silence. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't just a game anymore. He was getting closer, his presence more tangible, more real. And Sarah knew deep down that the silence wouldn't last much longer. The scream was coming, and when it did, there would be no escaping it. The days bled together in a haze of fear and sleepless nights for Sarah. Each night brought new horrors, more grotesque gifts from Art, more chilling reminders that his game was far from over. Every time she thought she had reached the peak of terror, Art would push her deeper into the abyss. It wasn't just her home that felt unsafe anymore. It was the whole world. James, the only person she could trust, had grown distant. He was still investigating, still digging into the clues that tied Art's recent killings to Sarah. But there was something in his voice when he spoke to her now, something colder. She tried to tell herself it was the strain of the case, but deep down she felt it was more than that. It was almost as if he knew something he wasn't telling her, as if he was beginning to see her as part of the problem, not the solution. Sarah paced the confines of her house, every creak in the floorboards sending shivers down her spine. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. She needed to get out. She needed to breathe. But the thought of stepping outside, of putting herself in the open where Art could be waiting, was unbearable. Then the phone rang. She jumped, her heart racing as she glanced at the screen. It was James. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the phone for a moment before answering. "Sarah," his voice was low, serious. "I've found something. You need to come to the old theater." The old theater. Sarah hadn't been there in years. It was a relic from another time, a place she had once loved as a child, but now stood abandoned, forgotten. The thought of going there now, in the middle of this nightmare, filled her with dread. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you need to see," James replied, his tone cryptic. "It's about Art, about why he's fixated on you." Her stomach twisted into knots. She wanted to say no, wanted to stay in the relative safety of her house, but she couldn't ignore the urgency in James's voice. If there was a chance to understand why Art had chosen her, why he was tormenting her, she had to take it. Maybe then she could find a way to end this once and for all. She agreed to meet him, though every fiber of her being screamed against it. The old theater stood at the edge of town, its grand facade crumbling with age. Once a place of joy and laughter, it now loomed in the darkness like a tombstone, its windows black and hollow. Sarah parked a block away, her hands shaking as she stepped out of the car. The wind whipped around her, carrying the faint sound of creaking metal as the theater's old sign swayed in the breeze. She hesitated at the entrance, staring at the large, rusted doors. A thick layer of dust coated the handle, and the faintest outline of a handprint marred the otherwise untouched surface. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she realized it had been left for her. An invitation or a warning. Pushing the doors open, she stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty lobby. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the dim light from the street outside barely penetrated the gloom. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of James, or worse, of Art. The silence was suffocating. Every sound, every breath felt amplified in the stillness. She made her way through the lobby, her hand trailing along the cracked walls as she moved toward the auditorium. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing the massive, decaying room beyond. Rows of rotting seats stretched out before her, their upholstery torn and faded. The stage, once the heart of the theater, was barely visible in the darkness, shrouded in shadow. And there at the center of it all was Art. He stood on the stage, motionless, his grotesque grin stretched wide beneath the dim glow of a single spotlight. His head was tilted at that unnatural angle, his eyes fixed on her as though he had been waiting for this moment, this very scene to unfold. For a moment, Sarah couldn't move. Her body was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sight of him, by the reality of his presence. She had seen him in her nightmares, had imagined this encounter 1,000 times, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer horror of standing in his shadow. Behind him, the stage was set. Props had been arranged, a sickening mockery of a play, with scenes that echoed her own life. There was a replica of her childhood home, crudely constructed out of rotting wood. A figure, disturbingly lifelike, sat at a table, a twisted version of her mother, her eyes hollow and empty. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized what Art had done. He had recreated her memories, her fears, and laid them out before her like some grotesque performance. And she was the star. As she stepped closer, her legs trembling beneath her, Art's head tilted even further, his eyes gleaming with malevolent glee. He didn't speak, he never did, but his presence was enough. She could feel the weight of his intent, the sickening joy he took in her terror. Her eyes darted to the side of the stage, searching for James, but he was nowhere to be seen. Panic began to rise in her chest. Had he lured her here? Had this all been part of the plan? She couldn't trust anyone anymore, not even herself. Art began to move, his slow, deliberate steps echoing in the empty theater. He reached down, picking up a rusted prop, a butcher's knife, its blade stained with dried blood. Sarah took a step back, her heart racing as she realized there was no way out. The stage was set, the performance had begun, and she was trapped in the leading role. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, broken only by the sound of Art's footsteps as he drew closer. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing for an escape, but there was none. This was it, the final act. She backed toward the edge of the stage, her hands trembling as she felt the cool metal of the fire escape ladder behind her. Without thinking, she grabbed it and began to climb, her body moving on instinct alone. Art watched her, his grin widening as he followed, his movements slow and deliberate, savoring the chase. As she reached the top of the ladder, Sarah glanced down, her heart sinking as she saw him standing directly below her, the knife gleaming in the dim light. There was nowhere left to run. The silence before the scream was over. Now all that remained was the terror that followed. And in that moment, Sarah realized that the stage had been set long before she had ever walked into this theater. Art had been pulling the strings from the very beginning, and now the final curtain was about to fall. The final act had begun. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she clung to the top of the fire escape ladder, the rusted metal cutting into her palms. Below her, Art the Clown stood at the base of the ladder, his head tilted in that eerie way, the grotesque grin still plastered on his face. The butcher's knife glinted in his hand, catching the dim light that filtered through the decrepit theater. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant groaning of the wind through the cracks in the old building. Sarah's heartbeat pounded in her ears, drowning out every other sound, but she could still feel Art's presence, an oppressive weight pressing down on her. He was enjoying this, her terror, her helplessness. He had drawn her into this twisted play, and now the final scene was about to unfold. But she wasn't ready to die. Not like this. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, Sarah scrambled across the narrow catwalk that ran above the stage. The structure creaked beneath her weight, the old metal groaning with each step, but she kept moving, driven by the primal instinct to survive. Below her, Art began to climb, his movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring each second of her terror. She reached the end of the catwalk and looked down. The stage was far below, a sea of shadows and debris. There was no way out. She was trapped, and Art was getting closer with every second. Panic clawed at her throat, threatening to choke her, but she forced herself to focus. There had to be something, some way to escape, some way to fight back. Her eyes scanned the area around her, searching for anything she could use, and then she saw it. Hanging above the stage, a massive lighting rig, its rusted bolts barely holding it in place. If she could get to it, if she could loosen those bolts. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. With shaking hands, Sarah made her way toward the rig, her heart racing as Art's footsteps echoed from the ladder behind her. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of what was coming. She had no illusions anymore. This was going to end tonight, one way or another. She reached the rig and grabbed hold of the nearest bolt, her fingers slipping on the rusted metal. Desperation fueled her as she tugged at it, praying that it would come loose. Below her, Art's footsteps grew louder, closer. He was almost at the top. The first bolt gave way with a sickening creak, and the rig shifted slightly, swaying above the stage. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat as she yanked at the second bolt. It refused to budge, stubbornly holding fast. And then she felt it. A presence behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know he was there. Art, standing just a few feet away, his twisted grin fixed on her, the knife glinting in his hand. Her hands trembled as she pulled harder, her entire body shaking with the effort. Art took a slow, deliberate step forward, the sound of his shoes clicking against the metal catwalk like a countdown. Click, click. The second bolt came free with a sudden jolt, and the rig lurched dangerously to the side. Sarah stumbled, barely catching herself before she fell, her heart slamming against her ribs. The rig swayed above the stage, casting eerie, shifting shadows across the floor below. But it wasn't enough. Art stepped closer, his silent laughter vibrating in the air between them. He was savoring the moment, his black eyes gleaming with sadistic delight. He lifted the knife, pointing it toward her as though inviting her to take her final bow. A scream built in Sarah's throat, but she swallowed it down. She couldn't give him that satisfaction. Not yet. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she threw herself at the final bolt, her fingers tearing at the metal until they were slick with blood. The rig groaned, teetering dangerously, and then, finally, it gave. With a deafening crash, the entire structure came down, slamming into the stage below with the force of a collapsing building. The impact sent a shockwave through the theater, shaking the walls and raining debris from the ceiling. For a moment, everything was chaos. Dust filled the air, blinding her, and the sound of collapsing metal rang in her ears. She couldn't see Art, couldn't tell if the rig had hit him or if he had somehow avoided it. But she couldn't take any chances. Staggering to her feet, Sarah peered through the thick cloud of dust, her heart pounding as she searched the wreckage for any sign of movement. The stage was a mess of twisted metal and broken wood, the rig lying in pieces across the floor. And then, from beneath the debris, a figure stirred. Article, his pale face streaked with blood, emerged from the rubble, his grin still impossibly wide, his eyes locked on her. He was injured, badly, but he was still alive, still coming for her. Sarah's legs felt like they were made of lead, but she forced herself to move, to run. She made her way back toward the ladder, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She could hear him behind her, dragging himself through the wreckage, relentless in his pursuit. She reached the ladder and began to climb down, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold on. Below her, the stage loomed, dark and menacing. She had to get out. She had to escape. But just as she reached the bottom, she felt a cold hand close around her ankle. She screamed, kicking out wildly, her foot connecting with something solid. Art's grip loosened and she stumbled back, her heart racing as she turned to face him. He was right there, inches away, his face twisted in a mask of fury and glee. Blood dripped from his mouth, staining his teeth red, but he didn't seem to notice. He was focused entirely on her, his hand reaching out, his fingers brushing against her skin. And then, with one final surge of strength, Sarah grabbed the nearest piece of debris, a jagged shard of metal, and drove it into his chest. Art's grin faltered for the first time, his eyes widening in surprise as he staggered back, his hands clutching the wound. For a moment he stood there, swaying on his feet, and then he collapsed, his body hitting the stage with a sickening thud. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood there, gasping for breath, her entire body trembling. It was over. It had to be. She had finally beaten him. But even as she stared down at his lifeless body, a cold dread crept over her. This wasn't the end. It never would be. Art the Clown wasn't just a man. He was something far worse, something that couldn't be killed so easily. And as Sarah turned to leave the theater, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, somehow, he was still watching her, still waiting. The curtain had fallen, but the show was far from over.